Welcome everybody, each and every one of you, those in virtual and those of you in person. We would like to first acknowledge that the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at NYU rests on Lenape-Hawking, Lenape homeland. As we gather in this virtual and in-person space, we ask you to join us in acknowledging the Lenape community, elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. I want to first thank CLACS, Johanna Morales, Cynthia Vasquez, Gabriel McGranner, Omar Dauharke, who are accompanying us all throughout this month, preparing for the different talks, but especially for this one. I just want to thank all the directors like Ada Ferrer, with whom we started this working group, Sinclair Thompson, Jill Lane, and now Dylan Robbins. And I really want to thank your presence here. This is our second in-person event, so we really thank you for being here too. And I just want to say a few words about the CLACS Working Group on Racisms in Comparative Perspective. It was created in 2010. This group and presenters provide past, current, and forthcoming analysis of race and racism in the Americas as a working group, which is part of the larger Red de Investigación Acción Antirracista en las Américas. We want to continue contributing to the debate on how best to fight against old and emerging forms of racism and racist, classist, patriarchal backlashes. We are glad to announce that this is the 50th faculty working group session. In fact, Zaira Simone-Thompson, is the first CLACS alumni participating in the group, and she's marking this 50th session, a truly landmark. Zaira is a Mellon postdoctoral fellow in the African American Studies at Wesleyan University. A geographer, her work and teaching centers on contemporary experiences and representations of slavery, colonialism, and uneven development in the Caribbean. Her dissertation, A Discursive Geography of Repair, exploring regional and national claims for reparative justice in the Caribbean, examines the symbolic and material forces of reparative claims in Barbados. The title of her talk today is Finding Repair in a Small Place, the Decommissioning of Lord Horatio Nelson in Barbados. We welcome you, my dear Zaira. Please, adelante con tu charla.
I first want to thank Professor Kala and the CLACS Working Group on Comparative Racisms for the invitation. In many ways, this evening is a reunion, of course, with one of my dear mentors and with the CLACS community, a space that reintroduced me in many ways to the Caribbean. This evening, I share an extract of my dissertation, one of my dissertation chapters titled Take Down Nelson, The Struggle for Repair in Barbados, which I'm currently revising for publication. On November 16th of 2020, Lord Horatio Nelson, who was memorialized by Barbadian plantocracy for his 1805 victory in the Battle of Trafalgar, was removed from where he resided since 1813, in Barbados National Hero Square, formerly known as Lord Nelson Square. The occasion was celebrated with spoken word and other live performances, including a testimony by Barbados Prime Minister Mia Mottley, both global Black Lives Matter demonstrations and the forced removals of colonial statues witnessed over the heated summer months of 2020 had summoned this moment. Yet demands for the removal of Nelson's statue precede the most recent iteration of BLM. In the 1990s, the mighty Gabby, one of Barbados' most famous calypsonians, first sang Take Down Nelson and protests calling for the removal of colonial vestiges. And in the early 2000s, organizations like the Committee for National Reconciliation advocated for the removal of Nelson's statue. At the time, the Committee for National Reconciliation endorsed the removal of Nelson, but called for his statue to be treated with dignity and respect. In a sense, the committee's request was honored within the ceremony 20 years later, as Nelson was carefully extracted from National Hero Square. However, the ceremony concluded with a live performance of the Mighty Gabby's famous Take Down Nelson. Like the Grim Reaper, adorned in all black and hosting his black guitar instead of a scythe, Gabby belted, "Nelson belonged to Trafalgar Square in London town, not down here." The ceremony sought to exorcise colonial hauntings from the Barbadian landscape to remove Nelson from his place. But I argue that the decommissioning is not just a moment that buries the past, but that conjures the present. In this chapter, I discuss how the decommissioning of a colonial hero captures some of the ways justice is envisioned within a small place. With Jamaica Kincaid in mind, I use the concept of a small place to challenge conventional readings of scale, to question imaginings of Barbados as insular to geopolitical transformations. My reading of the ceremony is based on observations from a live stream of the decommissioning, which was provided by the Barbados Labour Party, the political party of the current Prime Minister. COVID-19 made it impossible to physically observe the removal of Nelson in National Hero Square. So while my reading is partial in the sense that it does not account for expressions not recorded, it is an entry to public imaginings of Nelson's removal. My research is guided by the following questions. How does the decommissioning generate more attention to the reparations question? How is repair and sovereignty conceptualized through each of these performances? But more important, what do these performances suggest about Barbados' contested historical experience? I engaged theorists of Black geographies and Black studies to work through the above questions, and this is covered in more depth in the paper that you all read. I do close readings of the ceremony, Cindy Celeste's spoken word performance, the Prime Minister's speech, and other activities to illuminate how the decommissioning gestured a range of histories and struggles that are punctuated by political transformation, drawing attention to how the removal of Lord Nelson's statue builds on regional demands for reparations from former colonial powers and the Barbadian struggle for sovereignty, which I argue are complementary aims. The Barbadian government removed the statue of Nelson, not only to honor historical demands for the decommissioning of colonial markers, which were energized by the BLM protests in the summer of 2020, but to also mark Barbados' anniversary of independence, whereas the Prime Minister argues to resume the project of nation building, Barbados transitioned to a republic, which it is today. On September 15th of 2020, the Barbados Parliament announced to the world its decision to become a republic on the upcoming anniversary of its independence. These calls for a Barbadian head of state can be traced back to the 90s, and specifically to the Barbados Labour Party, which at the time was invested in renaming of landmarks, in the recreation of national heroes, and proposals for republic status, as well as initiatives for reconciliation, and Pan-Africanism is an important part of that project. Prime Minister Motley is also part of this journey, because as former Prime Minister of Culture, she advocated for the removal of Nelson's statue. It is equally important to account for how those who were involved in the decommissioning of Nelson, including Motley, have been active in CARICOM's movement for reparations for slavery and colonialism. Since 2013, members of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, a collective of scholars and activists representing the Caribbean community, have advocated for European nations to both acknowledge and commit to restorative justice for transatlantic slavery and colonialism. Barbados has a particular connection to the formation of regional claims in the Caribbean. Sir Hilary Beckles and David Decommissioning, who are both former members of Barbados National Task Force for Reparations, note that the concept of the CRC was first introduced by the Barbadian Pan-African Commission in the 90s and supported by the University of the West Indies prior to its establishment in 2013. And as mentioned, BLM is another force of Nelson's removal from Barbados. In response to the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Barbadians, including the Caribbean Movement for Peace and Integration, took to the streets and the beach to declare their support for the global struggle for abolition, including the removal of Nelson and all material and symbolic traces of colonialism that threatened Black life. So what I've tried to do thus far is sketch out the multi-scalar processes that culminate in this moment in which Nelson is removed from Barbados. I now transition to providing a deep reading of the ceremony. After a percussion performance of the Barbadian national anthem, Cindy Celeste graced the ceremony with her spoken word performance titled, "Watch This Space." Watch This Space contemplates Barbados' trajectory to sovereignty, or what I call a reparatory space. In the piece, Celeste calls attention to the liminality of the Barbadian landscape, the formation of Bridgetown as an engine of plantation labor, of death, of what would later be envisioned and constructed as a space for healing. But in her second act titled History, Celeste asks, but how do you convince someone that they want something when they don't even know it's needed, end quote. Here, Celeste reflects on public attitudes towards the decommissioning of Nelson, overall indifference or ambivalence to discussions on repair in Barbados. And she points out that the silence and resistance to Nelson's removal are not merely informed by a discourse of historical preservation or questions about the material impacts of his absence, but that there's also a lack of self-consciousness that must be addressed. I quote, how do we market rehabilitated consciousness to the masses? How do we convince our brethren of the strength of symbolisms when we have spent so long living on the surface interpretation of our identities, by the bare necessities, while self-hate still lingers in our communities, end quote. Therefore, the dilemma is not solely about the memory of a particular space, but the cultural and political consciousness of Barbadians, or to be exact, the permutations of anti-Blackness, an ongoing battle for reparation activists in Barbados and throughout the region. In her efforts to conscientize those bearing witness to Nelson's removal, Celeste honors the many who have struggled to reclaim National Hero Square and bring legitimacy to these demands. I quote, today we assert that Black Lives Matter, that the voices of the Committee for National Reconciliation and the Caribbean Movement for Peace and Integration and the African Heritage Foundation and the Pan-African and the activists and the historian and the hashtags Nelson must fall, take down Nelson, and even the Calypsonians that past powers have tried to silence have been trending for a reason, finally ending the debate for the average Bajan, end quote. Celeste's reading gives a sense of how the struggle for repair is a multifaceted process that has been led by both national and grassroots activism and inspired by artists, but it also situates the decommissioning and past decolonial movements and further centralizes this moment within the global struggle for Black Lives Matter. The other claim made here is that the decommissioning settles Barbadian debates on Nelson. Although conceptualized as another phase or iteration of the struggle for repair, the decommissioning is treated not only as a finality to unconsciousness, but a day of reckoning, as captured in Celeste's poem titled Informed Consent. I quote, but someone gave us permission to care on this day. We are no longer accepting disrespect and non-action in the fight for reparations, especially in the same square, where the case that dehumanized our ancestors stood to protect a monument to a man that was a hero to none of us. On this day, we are reclaiming, solving the scars of our violent history to smooth the screaming skin. On this day, we proudly pronounce our culture, talk and we language without calling it improper, taking back what belonged to we, end quote. November 14th not only marks the reclamation of National Hero Square from Lord Nelson, but it's also a proclamation of self-determination, which is significant for the reparations movement, both for national as well as regional claims made by the CRC today. However, what defines November 14th as a day of reckoning is not merely the removal of a symbol that has long celebrated plantocracy, but the testimony and spoken words such as Black Lives Matter, and even the inclusion of stigmatized speech like patois. The reckoning is also created by the audience that's being asked to bear witness in order to heal. There are other acts in the ceremony that promote healing, both for those present in person and online. The tenantry and Salif Smith's rendition of the Dickinson slave song, an enslaved blues documented by the 17th century abolitionist William Dickinson, can be read as sonic counters to anti-Blackness. In a similar fashion to the forklift, these reenactments uproot Nelson from his pedestal to heal Black Barbadians. Adorned in all white, the colors of libation, Salif Smith drums as the women belt, I quote, "Massa by me, he won't kill me." The song is a testimony to the abuses of plantation slavery and to the commodification of slave labor, in which they sing, I quote, "For he kill me, he ship me regular," end quote. But in this contemporary version, the performers are singing in the presence of Nelson, who is caged by scaffolding. It is as if the chorus of the laboring is evidence to be used against the memory of Nelson, to disrupt any further attachments to coloniality and or the ambivalent attitudes towards justice making. Although not documented, it appears that some improvisations have been made to the Dickinson song, and these new lyrics further illuminate not just the dehumanization of slavery, but legitimize the government's actions to remove statues that haunt Black Barbadians. The tenantry sings, I quote, "You buy me, you shoot me, you rape me, you can't kill me. I was born to be free," end quote. Again, it's unclear if Dickinson omitted these lyrics or if they were later added, but what stands out is the specific description of crimes committed by slave masters, what would be identified today as crimes against humanity. In the absence of their ancestors who first gave this testimony, the tenantry sings these words with their backs to Nelson. Like National Hero Square, the Dickinson song is also reclaimed from British abolitionism, as these performers honor their ancestors by retelling their accounts in their own voices and in a space where plantocracy was memorialized. The performers wear white, not for Nelson, but in mourning of those who first sang the laboring blues. The song is not just testimony of the past, but perhaps an admonition of how this space was made for those celebrating and indifferent to the erasure of Nelson's memory from National Hero Square. And while the decommissioning is an assemblage made through dramatizations of the past and present, Mia Motley is the master of ceremonies. The removal of Nelson and the reparative project is not conceivable without her honorable declaration. In conversation with Celeste's performance of Watch This Space, Motley begins with a reflection on Barbadian colonial realities, which in a sense have been obscured by the presence of Nelson in Bridgetown. Yet the built environment is imagined as a witness to the violent truths of colonialism as expressed in Motley's speech. I quote, "If these streets could talk, they'll be telling us a lot of stories this evening. They'll be telling us the stories of those who wondered whether they were lucky or whether they were truly condemned when they moved from the boats to the shore of this nation. They would remember those who didn't make it, and they would come to understand that everything that they held dear, the love for one another, their gods, their ability to speak truth to each other, that all of these things would have been taken from them and would continue to be taken from them in this alien land that they would now call home. If these streets could talk, they would tell us very clearly that this statue that we move here today really reflected an assertion of power, of dominance," end quote. The streets are imagined as deponents because they carry ancestral memory that counters colonial historiography. To remedy this past begins with the extraction of Nelson. This is one message that Motley seeks to get across to those watching, and specifically to naysayers. But what are the specific ailments that are in need of healing? Because as Motley notes, healing is not restricted to Nelson standing in a Black republic. Anti-Blackness is identified as one illness that not only affects the South from generation to generation, but threatens what Motley envisions as nation building. Motley says, I quote, "When you hear people in the past tell you come out the sun, you're getting too dark, it was intended to be a signal to you that dark was not good, and we know Black is beautiful. When they told you that you need to do something with your hair, I didn't get the message. When they told us that fairer is better, and the reason why I'm talking to you out here now, Barbadians, is because I wonder how we have come this far for anybody to be buying bleach in this country or any part of the Caribbean," end quote. Notions of color and caste are not only harmful to Black Barbadians, but antagonistic to self-determination, not only in Barbados, but throughout the Caribbean. She's also scolding Barbadians who have supported these harms by bleaching. She retorts, I quote, "I didn't get the message," which suggests that Motley is an exemplification of self-determination as she rejects the aesthetics of colonial white supremacy. Her resistance to performances of coloniality are not merely mirrored in her dress or Pan-Africanist leanings, but also by her positionality as a Black queer woman, which perturbs Christian conservatives. Still, she does not abandon the logics that define Barbadian respectability. Nevertheless, Motley exemplifies a reparative vision, which online viewers of the ceremony speak to, which I address further on. Motley also demands accountability from Barbadian citizens to combat moral corruption in all of its dimensions. I quote, "It means that we need to have different conversations with our children. It means that we need to explain to our children what truly are the things that are likely to undermine them, whether it is mental infiltration in their heads, the notion that bleaching can help somebody, the notion that guns can make you powerful, other than to put you in the Glengarry Dodds, the prison, or in the Westbury Cemetery, or Coral Ridge, the funeral home. To have the difficult conversations that ask young ladies and young men not to denigrate themselves. You can have fun, you can do all of the things that you want to do, without making people objects of sexual exploitation," end quote. Here, Motley refers to the surge of violence that has threatened the island's image for the past couple of years, and again to the epidemic of skin bleaching and sexual exploitation. Although not explicitly called out, globalization and colonialism are the forces that have induced moral crisis. Motley warns that if these issues are not addressed within the home, then Barbados will be colonized again, because consciousness is the core of the nation state. To be clear, her warning is not directed at Parliament, but to Barbadian nationals, and in particular, Barbadian youth who are imagined as lacking consciousness. The assumption is that re-socialization is required to continue the process of nation building, and specifically the Republic Project. The Prime Minister spent significant time telling Barbadians that the nation is faced with a moral and spiritual crisis. But what are the material damages that require repair? The Prime Minister pays significant attention to issues of morality and consciousness rather than, say, physical crisis, or the rise of unemployment, or the marginalization of Barbados within the world of international finance. However, in her aim to convince Barbadians of the importance of reparations, Motley emphasizes that uneven development constrains the possibilities of independence. I quote, "We too have recognized that the development trajectory of Barbados since 1966 ought to have and could have achieved much more than just the development trajectory of any of the Caribbean nations who were previous colonies. They've ought to have achieved more. And it's largely because, my friends, we did not have anything in the kitty, the bank, to start with," end quote. Here, nation building does not weigh on the consciousness of Barbadians, but in colonial extraction, which has left the Caribbean with nothing in the kitty. Whereas she argues colonial beneficiaries were compensated. Therefore, Barbados, like the rest of the Caribbean, deserves restitution. Although she recognizes the urgency for structural transformation to eliminate poverty, the biggest challenge is creating a conscious society. Motley says, I quote, "We cannot pass legislation to emancipate people's minds," end quote. And yet mental emancipation, which is the aim of self-repair, is entwined with the project of nation building, meaning that nationalism in all forms is integral to the struggle for repair. In chapter 2 of my dissertation, I argued that Ero Barrow, Barbados' first prime minister, first represented this vision of nationalism, which is represented in the ceremony. Motley asserts that as children of independence, Barbados must recommit to the Republic project, which was first initiated by national reconciliation projects of the 90s, but that to progress as a nation requires Barbadians to feel whole. The recreation of National Hero Square, including the development of Bridgetown, are a part of this process. Another argument presented in the ceremony is that cultural and political transformation requires a Barbadian head of state. Motley contends that the possibility of a Barbadian child becoming a president should be neither trivialized or contested within a society that claims its independence, but also because the representation of a presumably Black Barbadian president instills faith in a younger generation that continues to confront anti-Blackness, bleaching, and other rejections of Blackness. To reiterate, consciousness, or what Motley refers to as mental emancipation, is a pivotal step towards nation building. The desire for statehood is predicated on such visions of a Black Barbadian, one who exudes Black pride, takes responsibility, and upholds morality. Although sovereignty is the focal point of Motley's proposal for national healing, and that is centered on notions of responsibility, she also argues that repair is inconceivable without restitution. In other words, repair is not a metaphor. Rather, Motley explicitly refers to the compensation that Caribbean states are overdue and identifies the reparations case as a necessary means to emancipation, to move on from the past. But reparative justice seeks to reckon with the past and its continuities. So in some way, Motley's message here enables the very denial and ambivalence that is targeted throughout the ceremony. But more importantly, it problematizes Pan-Africanist sensibilities of justice and honoring the lived experiences of ancestors and even the discourse of reparative collectives who constantly confront the disavowal from former colonial powers. The question is, how are those who are tuned into the ceremony, both near and far, responding to these performances and even more to the call for repair? Nelson's removal is imagined as a religious spiritual awakening, not just a political statement. One viewer says, I quote, "That statue was keeping us back. Way to go forward in Jesus' name." Nelson's presence in National Hero Square has prohibited social progress. And for the viewer, progress, moving forward, is a process ordained by Jesus, which exposes how Barbadian nationalism continues to be defined by Christian doctrine. There's also this sense that the ceremony is imbued with the power of God, or as one viewer puts it, I quote, "Thank you, Barbados. God's love is victorious." Whereas for another viewer, Nelson's removal is an act of ancestral worship. I quote, "One down physically, many more to go mentally. Glorify our ancestors," end quote. What is of interest here is the distinction made between the conceptual and the material forms of justice. Nelson's removal is seen as only the beginning of a journey towards self-repair, which is emphasized in the Prime Minister's speech. The discussion on the Barbados Labour Party's live stream also included recommendations for next steps to be taken after the decommissioning. These were mostly proposals for other historical figures to be honored in Nelson's place. One viewer suggests, I quote, It's National Hero Square. We need an appropriate monument to capture the superhuman sacrifices and hard work exemplified by national heroes, end quote. But what are the superhuman sacrifices that encapsulate Barbadian identity? Which heroes should be revered here? Again, in the minds of many Black Barbadians, Nelson does not embody the true values of Barbadian national heroes. One viewer proposes for Barbados' first Black forefathers, Arrow Barrow and Grantley Adams, to be honored where Nelson stood, while others propose for Barbadian national symbols like the coat of arms or the Barbadian flag to be placed in the same location. Another viewer even proposes for the statue of Bussa to be moved from its current location and put in the square, since it was Bussa who led Barbados' first enslaved rebellion. In spite of the pageantry and the Prime Minister's efforts to connect with and educate Barbadians, for many viewers, the decommissioning felt incomplete. One viewer says, I quote, "I thought this was a decommissioning. Seems more like a commissioning celebration. This should have taken down Nelson and erected a local hero in his place," end quote. In other words, the removal of Nelson and accompanied performances did not fulfill the expectations of a decommissioning, since a Barbadian hero was not immediately erected in Nelson's place. Another viewer calls for the destruction of Nelson's statue, which the Barbadian government has decided to move to a more appropriate place, the museum. So although Nelson no longer sits securely at National Hero Square, his memory lives on as he remains on Barbadian soil, even if out of sight. The viewer's call for Nelson to be obliterated echoes the demands of many activists for the destruction of colonial effigies and those who have taken justice into their own hands by either obliterating these statues or pushing them into the sea. Acts of Black critique. The first viewer's critique of the commissioning celebration, like the call for Nelson's obliteration, speaks largely to the connections between justice and time. In contrast to Motley's discourse of repair and nation building, these viewers see justice as immediate transformation, not as a process that requires self-introspection or diplomacy. Yet Barbados is praised for its respectable response to the past, as demonstrated in this viewer's comment. I quote, "I witnessed, due to the recent global protests against racism, most statues of races were defaced and removed by violence. Kudos on this nonviolent removal. A great replacement would be our coat of arms," end quote. The defacing of statues is demonized here, whereas nonviolent institutional statue removals and colonial regalia are not only seen as legitimized symbols of repair, but as authentic representations of Barbadian identity. The viewer's praise of the decommissioning also affirms Motley's demands for Barbadians to uphold morality and all attributes that define Barbadian nationalism. And while these values of respectability defy forms of Black critique, they have not entirely abandoned the logics or the aims of Black emancipation. Again, the discourse of mental emancipation and the urgency to redesign slavery's infrastructure to create spaces that speak to the lived experiences of Black Barbadians is evidence of this. The decommissioning is memorable, not necessarily because Nelson no longer occupies a space that defines Barbadian identity, but because Prime Minister Motley made this moment possible, at least for those watching online. The Prime Minister is revered for taking down Nelson, a mission that brings Barbados to the future, or as one viewer puts it, I quote, "We are moving forward as a nation, and it takes this long to get there. I salute our Prime Minister for getting us there. You are the best thing that has happened to Barbados in years. I'm proud to call myself a Bajan, so filled with pride," end quote. Motley embodies a Barbadian future, a desire to move forward. There's a sense that creating a new present, not only for Barbados, but for the Caribbean, is impossible without Motley's leadership, her foresight. One viewer says, I quote, "Just imagine what the West Indies would be like if it had a prime minister and Mia was in charge. It would be awesome," end quote. Motley's testament does not only invoke Barbadian pride in what can be read here as a call for the revitalization of the Caribbean Federation, led by Motley, and her words also encourage self-introspection. As articulated by one viewer, I quote, "I feel I can finally be more because of you, Prime Minister Motley," end quote. In a sense, the Prime Minister's call for self-repair, for looking in the mirror or having difficult conversations is answered in this case. This viewer is moved to be more like their Prime Minister. Days after the decommissioning, Ninja Man, a Black Barbadian street performer, took over National Hero Square. Ninja Man chose a pair of horns, 2 swords, and a vest with an image of a lion instead of the coat of arms or the national flag, as recommended by some viewers. Ninja Man heard the wails, the libations, the questions are you free, the testimonies for repair. A man who would not be permitted in spaces because of his vagrancy responded to the call and took Nelson's place, even if momentarily. After all, the desired outcome of the reparations struggle is for Black people to reclaim their place. But is Ninja Man's occupation of National Hero Square a counter to the decommissioning? Is it a mockery of those who accept nation building and its markers as repair? Again, Ninja Man, who does not personify the moral values that young Barbadians are asked to model, demonstrated that the decommissioning was not complete, as what was left was a bare pedestal, an entry for more Black placemaking. Thank you.
It's amazing how from a small ceremony you could show the multiscalar sources and forces that acted on it and complexify what's official, what's from below. And I think it's a very interesting, it's a very interesting case where you can definitely look at repair from below and repair from above and discuss what it means to nation build, right? In a context, in a moment in history where the nation state is in crisis, right? And we are seeing forces of global racial capitalism acting on each side in such different ways and yet in such similar ways. So thank you for taking us here. And I am going to open it to questions and comments for all of you.
Well, I have to say that I loved it. I think how you connect the different actors and actresses, I don't know how to say in a gender neutral way, that are in this play field, they are very important, right? And they have a role where I believe that I'm a science woman, I'm an engineer, so I know that when you alter like 1 degree of something, you know, like water becomes ice at 0 degree. Here in 1 degree, like Celsius sometimes. It just doesn't work. So the way you put all these actors together and the roles that they play in the dream of a post-colonial world is something that we were talking about. I think it's very important and very interesting because we're talking about how the macro systems are embedded in micro actions. And it makes me feel, I just follow Mia Motley while you were talking on Twitter, because I think that dialogue between self-accountability, the bravery and courage that it takes not to only to talk about having difficult conversations, but to front them with, poise and grace aligned to the higher self after your body being in the middle of a conflict and war speaks a lot. And we always in class are talking like, are this what can be considered as affirmative actions? Like, are they really having a positive or detrimental impact in our communities? I think that you answered that when you say they did that, but they also followed with actions. And I think that is the important part of it. Like sometimes we're like, is this better or is it not better? Maybe that coalition of both things and a follow up on the ground from above and from below. I just love it all. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, thank you. I mean, that was, you know, in many ways, my intention, you know, to kind of like complicate how we imagine, you know, political transformation, right? And especially in a present, in our political present, right? Like what does that look like? And you know, that's why I'm so fascinated with the decommissioning, because it was, in many ways, it sort of exposes, I guess, the sort of paradox, right, of post-colonial nation building, right? It demonstrates, as much as it sort of aims to kind of like what it imagines itself doing, sort of producing a kind of conscious collective, a conscious civil society. It also shows at the same time that that process of repair, of forming a republic, is incomplete, right? Is incomplete. So yeah, and how do we make sense, right, of these like as you said, like sort of macro processes that are very much grounded, you know, in the everyday, right? In like everyday sensibilities. What does it mean for a prime minister to kind of like take on and sort of perform, right? These representations of what gets called repair, eventual emancipation. You know, concepts that in many ways are embedded in a genealogy, right, of Black life and religious traditions that are not reducible to bureaucracies, to the state. It's much more nuanced than that, right? Yeah. So thank you.
You made me think just now of that song by Paul Marley. Emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. None of us can free ourselves, right?
Exactly, and she actually, I mean, she makes these references, you know. I think at one point when she's giving one of her speeches, she motions to her phone to show the public, hey, you know, I have Bob Marley as a screensaver right here. So just to let you know, I'm really for, you know, mental emancipation. This is not an act. But at the same time though, I mean, that it's not only, I'm not so interested in sort of discerning sort of authentic political selves, that's not it. But rather trying to understand, you know, well, what are the conditions that enforce people to kind of perform in this kind of way?
Yeah.
Right? Right, and because that performance, as grounded as it is, you know, like as I say, in her sort of Pan-Africanist upbringing, and you know, and this is also like the post-independence generation, right? That is their grounding in many ways, but that gets problematized by, you know, what they sort of envision as a republic. I think I've recently come across some literature. There's now a sort of discourse called Republican economics in Barbados, right? Where people are trying to like, you know, come up with these proposals for redevelopment, right? But these proposals in many ways are kind of still rooted in, you know, neoliberal logics, right? So yeah, I'm quite interested in this sort of oscillation, you know, this movement that these actors participate in.
I have a question. Really cool to see how like music is in your work, and so from the like historical context, you mentioned the Take Down Nelson song, and then you go into the deep reading of the performance, and you're looking at the lyrics, but also improvisation, voice, and what it means for subjecthood. And I was just curious, does this, you know, does your approach with like music and performance, does it go through your entire dissertation and upcoming book project, or is it something sort of that this live stream really brought to you? I was just curious about sort of your approach with that, and sort of the role of music and performance and you know, creating a new present that you mentioned.
Yeah, so I mean, no, I only like thought about this in watching the live stream, which is kind of strange, right? Because my dissertation sort of covers different reparative moments, right? That are quite performative, as say, you know, the live performances that I reference, that I read here. But yeah, no, it was only in observing this live stream that I sort of began thinking about those connections in terms of, right, how music and other forms of performance, you know, enact repair, right? Enact repair not just for those who are watching, right? Those who are performing, but that they also have some kind of impact on how, that they also in some way are sort of reconstructing a space. And I say this just as the forklift, right, that gets used to remove Nelson. That they also have, they also carry those kinds of attributes. But I think that's interesting that you asked me that, because I thought about it like, you know, does my reading have anything to do with like my previous work in Carnival, or like am I kind of like circling back to engaging performance in this way? I haven't thought about it until now. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. I found it very interesting, a couple of things that you shared, and thank you for your presentation. It was very enlightening, specifically because, you know, the Caribbean does need a lot of repair, specifically because of all the colonial and enslavement of African and indigenous populations. And I think that it has not been acknowledged enough. So this movements like not only talk about the tragedies that happened in the Caribbean history, they visualize it, and these types of performative ways of resistance and of trying to create a new post-colonial reality for Caribbeans. It is something that is really highly needed. So I really like the way that you talked about how the pedestal was left there. And for me, the way that you said it and the way that I interpret it is like, so statues become like the seat with a historical person, that it is like a political stance, right? So when you take that historical person, but you're letting the seat open, it is like you're letting the seat open. And if you're not putting anything there, it is still the memory of what was there. So are we really like doing a complete reparation, or are we just like leaving the seat open to still talk about that memory of what was there, what was left? So we're leaving the scar open. We're leaving, like an open scar there for people to they're going to pass by it. It's going to become a redefinition of a historical landmark. So at what length, like actually the population of Barbados sees this as a complete repair, or just like a stance, or like footsteps towards like a genuinely repair from the ministry right now in Barbados.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, so I mean, I read a couple of like think pieces. I mean, my dissertation is a discourse analysis, so I spent a lot of time, you know, following social media, and other discursive representations. For many Barbadians, this really did not say much of anything, or rather the question was, you know, how does this sort of impact me materially? Especially in the height of like, you know, a pandemic, right? I mean, this happened in November of 2020, in which, you know, I mean, you're dealing with like a high percentage of unemployment. You're also, you know, dealing with, you know, like massive restructuring, because so much revenue, tourism revenue was lost, right? Because of COVID. So what is kind of interesting when watching the decommissioning is, and again, and this is kind of like when I say, you know, I acknowledge that my reading is partial, is because you don't entirely get to see, right, the reactions, right? The sort of subtle, you know, kissing teeth, the lookaways, the, you know, or even like more positive engagements. You can't pick up on that. But I remember spending a lot of time like pausing the live stream to like examine the faces, because sometimes the videographer would show the crowd. And there were many moments where, you know, I mean, you saw like a lot of older like Barbadian men, with their hand on their hip, you know, just looking at the performance, you know. So it's, I think there's like a spectrum of feelings about Nelson's removal. But from what I gathered, you know, those who have been in support of the reparation struggle, you know, going way back to the 90s or even prior, I think were receptive to finally seeing this happen. I mean, because these demands were being made since, particularly since the 90s. So, but then you have another fraction of society that is just asking, what does this do for me in terms of mobility, you know? What does this do for me in terms of recognition, you know, from Parliament? Yeah, so there's also critique.
I also wanted to ask you, when you said that there was some demand of removing that statue, like with honor, or like in a delicate manner, like, I mean, I'm a very visual person. What do you mean about that? Like, they wrapped him like in a blanket and they remove it slowly.
Yeah, so I mean, this
with
was
respectability.
right, exactly. I mean, and this is all like entrenched in respectability, right? I mean, so that the demand for Nelson to be carefully sort of extracted came from the Committee for National Reconciliation, which was organized in the 90s. And I mean, it's quite striking when you read that, you come across it. It's like, why does this need to be handled with care? And I think that response, I don't know, I think that statement, I think, sort of spoke to the racial tensions in Barbados at that time between white and Black Barbadians. Perhaps those who saw Nelson, you know, as a part of their identity, their history, or those who, you know, have these sort of general beliefs about historical preservation, right? There's a proper way to sort of deal with the past. But, you know, I refer to that because I think, yeah, I think it's interesting because, you know, it contrasts in many ways with, you know, what we saw over the summer of 2020, right? Where, you know, and those acts being imagined in the Barbadian context as like violent, right? Yeah. I mean, that's a simplification of it, but yeah, yeah.
You say more about the Ninja Man, who he was, if people talked about him, what if we know what he was trying to do?
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So what was interesting was this moment was captured by a local news source, Barbados Today. I think like the day after the decommissioning, I believe, Ninja Man came. And the way it was represented was almost kind of humoring this moment, you know, saying, I think, I don't know, the author of the post from Barbados Today was just, you know, kind of like mocking the bareness, right, of National Hero Square and how it was that, you know, Barbados' beloved Ninja Man, you know, decided to do something with it, right? So it was just sort of, yeah, like sort of, yeah, a commentary on that moment. And yet, I think days after, there was some documentation online of Ninja Man being asked by security to leave the front of the store or something like this, right? So there again, we see that paradox. But yeah, I mean, Ninja Man is unhoused. You know, he's identified as a street performer. I don't think anyone interviewed Ninja Man about that particular moment. It would be really interesting to like, yeah, it would be really interesting to ask Ninja Man about like what motivated him, right? To take Nelson's place and like, how does he feel about Nelson and how does he feel about the decommissioning? But more importantly, how does he feel about how the media portrayed that moment? Because it was just sort of treated as comedic, more than anything.
It's interesting. Yeah, I guess that this idea that comes in Carnival of reversal didn't occur there. It was just replacement of and I guess it is humorous, but is it subverting or not is the question, no?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think what is, and I read this moment with many of those who ground themselves in Black geography and Black studies. You know, I see this moment, yeah, in many ways as a Black counter to colonial forms of placemaking that have always, right, sort of functioned and aimed to sort of keep Black people in their place, right? And the fact that Ninja Man is, the fact that we do not know, right, what motivated Ninja Man, right, to sort of stand where Nelson stood, in many ways is a rejection to, I guess, the intelligibility, right, the legibility that gets ascribed to respectable acts of justice, of repair, like the decommissioning. We don't know, right, what exactly motivated Ninja Man to be there. What we do know is that Ninja Man has sort of refused to, in a sense, stay in his place, to remain rooted, right? And so that moment of him, you know, as I said, answering the call, right? But rejecting all of the requests for what should be placed there, I see that as a counter to colonial forms of placemaking.
You mentioned that there's a material and a conceptual way of conceiving of all this. And conceiving restitutions was a material way of accompanying, I guess, the mental emancipation part. So maybe you could talk about that. What exactly you meant by that?
Yeah, so I mean, there are certainly different conceptions of what constitutes as repair, right? You have many, I think, scholars of who are interested in the reparations question, who insists that, you know, repair, right, sort of speaks more to the conceptual and, you know, lived realities, right, of those who are imagined as being victims, right, of crimes against humanity. Whereas restitution specifically refers to compensation, right, that is owed to those who have been harmed. However, what I have observed, you know, from my doctoral research and speaking with reparations activists in the Caribbean and primarily in Barbados, is that, I mean, these are not, these binaries don't necessarily make sense. Because for many, and for many who identify themselves explicitly with Pan-Africanism, with other iterations of Rastafari, I mean, they don't see restitution or material forms of repair as antagonistic to, say, mental emancipation, right? Or to other social, cultural practices that sort of make people feel whole, right? That dichotomy doesn't exist for many. I think the narrative of the argument is, for many reparations activists, is that, you know, I mean, repair is an assemblage, right? It's sort of, there's nothing wrong with a paycheck, right? And that paycheck, you know, that paycheck makes one feel as whole, right? In conjunction with, say, other forms of restoration, with the revitalization of cultural and political institutions, right? As well with repatriation, right? So, I mean, I think that for many reparations activists, you know, repair is an assemblage, right? It includes all of these different practices and materials that sort of make one feel whole. And so that's why I sort of refer at times, you know, to repair as restitution, to repair as mental emancipation, and, you know, to repair as self-repair. I mean, of course, all of those things mean different things for descendants.
And I guess it also speaks to, when you talk about repair and restitution and mental emancipation in this multiple ways and logics, it speaks to getting away from the individualized affirmative action processes that we know of, and speaks to the more systemic racisms that have been forged in the Black Atlantic, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too that the discourse, right, on like affirmative action is, you know, quite grounded in, you know, a particular historical reality, right? I mean, so what I mean by that is, you know, say in the context of the US, when people think about reparations, well, before the increased visibility of demands now for reparations for African Americans, what came to mind was 40 acres and a mule, right? I mean, that was like the sort of framework that was engaged formally and informally on discussions of repair. And I think that framework in many ways is sort of defined by you know, the particularities of racial capitalism in the US, say in comparison to the Caribbean. And that's not to sort of provincialize in any way these visions, right, of reparative justice, because, you know, my argument has always been that reading the Decommissioning, right, and other representations of repair in the Caribbean, but particularly in Barbados, you know, the question that I have asked is, well, how much of these ideas, how much of these logics sort of stem from particular formations of place, right? So what is happening in Barbados, of course, is defined by its particular experience of slavery and colonialism. But that doesn't mean that it's happening in absence of interventions made elsewhere, right? Yeah.
It's more of a regional.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, you know, part of the reason why I'm a geographer, so.
My question is, you're talking about the different views of the same event and a very symbolic and powerful event. And I asked myself if you tried to, have you tried to quantify, like with those programs that people that analyze the scores sometimes use, the average of the opinions of I don't know, people that use social media or the cover of the event by television or newspapers. If you try to quantify the tendencies of how they evaluate the event during your analysis.
Yeah, that's a good question. That was something that in many ways I struggled with, because I felt like kind of caught in between trying to provide a kind of like ethnographic reading of the decommissioning, and of course, you know, being committed to discourse analysis, right, you would look for those things, especially in doing contextual analysis, right? How many times do these terms occur, right? How many times are they used, right? And so on and so on. Yeah, and in the end, no, I didn't. No, I didn't, and especially not for this. And I think, yeah, it just had a lot to do with my own sort of anxiety, with sort of restricting myself to a very, I don't want to call, I don't want to call those who do that kind of analysis constructivists, right? But to a very sort of technocratic way of examining discourse that is, you know, that's embodied, right? Discourse that is like moving across different scales. I just didn't want to compartmentalize, to put it in a simple way, compartmentalize what was occurring in that moment. And I think it had a lot to do with like my training in ethnography, but it is something that I am sort of revisiting for the book project, you know, because I do it in other parts of my dissertation. So I'm kind of like slipping in and slipping out of it.
Maybe you could talk about a little bit about the dissertation as a whole and your conclusions, and then that would be a good way to wrap it up.
Right. So broadly speaking, and I think, you know, Pamela did a good job of summarizing what my doctoral work was. It's essentially, as I said, a kind of discursive geographic reading of demands, right? Of institutional demands made for reparations, primarily on behalf of African descendants, as well as indigenous communities in the Caribbean. So initially, what I had wanted to do was a sort of comparative analysis examining the formation of these claims in Jamaica and Barbados, right? Places that in many ways share connections, but also differences in terms of nation building, as well as in the experiences of slavery and colonialism. But a lot happened in 2019, and then we were hit with COVID, right? So I mean, I had to do a lot of restructuring with the dissertation that only really just led me much more into sort of centering this work on the representations, you know, that I was sort of sitting with for years, even, you know, like two years before committing to a doctoral project. So I just did a lot of textual analysis of policy reports written by the CRC, but also spending a lot of time with the Barbados National Task Force Reparations Report, which was like a 289-page document, right? So what you asked in terms of like how I was quantifying discourse, I started off doing that with this huge document. And it made me sort of realize more about like the necessity and looking and trying to like sort of evaluate movements through their representations. So yeah, I mean, the dissertation is centered on the the narratives, you know, the narratives written by reparations activists, but particularly by reparation activists in Barbados, speaking on behalf of the nation state. And yeah, I mean, it was quite taxing to do that work in the middle of a pandemic. You know, to sort of write, to read in isolation is just really produces a lot of estrangement, you know? So at some point, yeah, I was just like you get quite like engrossed, but also like exhausted with just spending so much time with discourse, with social media, with written discourse, but yeah, there was, yeah. I'm recovering still. Yeah.
So that's why this chapter is sort of interesting, because it's one something.
Yeah. No, I mean, I you know, the decommissioning happened in November of last year. I think at that point, I was trying to figure out an additional chapter, and this was it. And I spent a lot of time rewatching the live stream. I spent a lot of time transcribing. I think at some point with like doing my final revisions for the dissertation, I had to reach back out to the spoken word artist to ask for her like original versions, and you know, so I think I felt the most liberated with writing this chapter. And again, I think it has a lot to do with my previous work at Carnival, but also, yeah, my training in ethnography, to sort of do something else that didn't require navigating, you know, pages of policy, right? So, I mean, that's fun too, but it's
And also again the conflicts, right? Like all the statues were coming down over the place, and sort of, I'm assuming you felt compelled.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you know, and this is why I say it's important to sort of think about, to engage the political present in my reading of the decommissioning, you know. Yeah, you had the BLM protests. You had a kind of like revitalization of discussions on repair, on abolition, right? And then dealing with the precarity, right, of the pandemic. I mean, those were all forces that finally led to the extraction of Nelson, right? And I think even now, with Barbados approaching its independence anniversary and swearing in their first president, I think there's also this acknowledgement that the decommissioning was in many ways phase one of pursuing the Republic project. So,
and that's why the incompleteness of the process is very clear.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for being here, all of you, and thank you, Zaira.